Hello everybody, my name is Mariako, and today I'm going to show you everything you need to know about Minecraft 1.9. You're probably aware that 1.9 has finally reached pre-release, and this means that we're getting very close to the official release of 1.9, with the only changes remaining likely to be bug fixes or minor tweaks. This means that we can take a close look at what's been added so far, and we'll have a pretty good idea of what 1.9 will be like when we can finally update our worlds and our servers to it. Now, I'm not going to be covering every single little change, because there are a lot of them, nor the changes to commands and command blocks, which did get some really awesome updates by the way, but instead we're going to be focusing mostly on the stuff that is going to affect your normal survival gameplay. Getting right to it, the first changes that we're going to cover are some of the biggest. Big enough for the entire update to be named after them, in fact. And of course I'm referring to the changes to combat. If you've only heard about one of the changes coming in 1.9, this would most likely be it, if only because of the massive stink that parts of the community caused when it was first revealed. This is the first time since version 1.0, or maybe even beta 1.8 depending on how you look at it, that the very core mechanics of combat have been changed. The first and most evident of these changes is that your attacks now have a soft cooldown, by which I mean that after each attack there is now a charge up time for your next attack. You can technically ignore this charge up and attack at any time, but the less time you give your attack to charge, the less damage it'll do. This effectively means that spam clicking does lower damage and should only really be used as a way to get mobs and players away from you, whereas if you want to do max damage, you'll want to time your attacks a little bit. If you want to see a visual indicator of the charge and when it's ready, you can enable that by going to Options, Video Settings, and changing the Attack Indicator option to either Crosshair or Hotbar. This change doesn't only affect swords. In fact, all of the tools in the game have different damage and charge times, but unfortunately the only two practical weapons are still going to be the sword and the axe. I won't go into specific damage values and whatnot, as they are likely to continue changing up until release, and likely even after that, but the general idea is that swords will have the highest potential output, but axes, which have a somewhat slower charge time, will deal more damage per hit. As of 1.9, you can no longer block with the sword, making it a little bit more even with the axe than it was previously, though you do still need to factor in that you cannot get things like looting or fire aspect on an axe. Before making your choice between the two though, there is one more important factor to keep in mind, and that is that both swords and axes now have a unique ability. For swords, this is a swipe-like attack that can hit multiple enemies, which you can trigger by attacking when you're moving slowly and have a full charge on your weapon. For axes, it's a more PvP-centric ability, which is that you have a chance to disable your opponent's shield. This chance is increased by your efficiency level, 5% per level, or basically guaranteed if you're sprinting when you hit them. Obviously, the axe's ability isn't near as useful for general play as the sword's is, so the sword will likely remain the weapon of choice outside of PvP. Now, if you're paying any attention at all, you'll have noticed the mentioning of shields. Yes, we have actual shields in the game now, and with some careful placement and timing, these can massively reduce the amount of damage that you take. Melee attack damage will be reduced by about 66%, while projectiles will bounce right off, and it can even block a good bit of damage from a creeper explosion. We have a new offhand slot in our inventory that we can put these into, and then, as long as whatever you're holding in your main hand doesn't have a right-click functionality, you can hold right-click to hold up the shield in front of you. The crafting recipe for these is relatively simple, requiring only some planks and a single piece of iron, and you can even combine them with a banner to put your own unique designs on them. Shields themselves aren't directly enchantable, though with books you can put unbreaking on them, as well as the new mending enchantment, which we'll cover in a little bit. We also have some interesting changes to arrows, most notably that you can now tip your arrows with potion effects. You can, for example, shoot your enemies with an arrow that will poison them or give them weakness. Or if you're feeling particularly trolly, you can shoot a creeper with an invisibility arrow and have it chase after your friends. Now these don't last particularly long, only 1/8 the length of the original effect, but they are pretty neat to play with. To craft these new tipped arrows, you'll need to use a lingering potion, another new feature that we'll cover in more detail in a minute, but in this case you use them by putting a lingering potion in the center of your crafting table and surrounding it with 8 arrows, similar to how you would when you're dyeing clay or glass. There was also a special type of arrow added called a spectral arrow that you can craft by placing an arrow in the middle of a cross of glowstone dust. Shooting a mob or a player with one of these arrows will give them an outline that can be seen through walls. Probably not something you'll use much in regular survival, but it's a cool feature nonetheless. One last thing under the general combat changes is that your health regeneration now has a dramatic effect on your hunger saturation. Basically, if you're damaged and you have full hunger and a bit of saturation, you'll start healing very, very quickly, and your saturation will drain at a similarly increased pace. This means that your hunger will rarely stay full when you're out fighting, but if you can find a moment to retreat and eat, then you will very quickly be back up to full health. Moving on, if we take a step back to when we equipped our shield, you'll remember it was put in a new offhand slot in our inventory. Now, shields aren't the only thing that can go here. In fact, you can place literally anything in this slot and even use that item under the right conditions. The general rule behind this is that when you left or right click, the game will first try and use what's in your main hand. And if the item in your main hand can't do anything with it, it will try and use what's in your offhand instead. Since swords can't block anymore, this means that you can use those and a shield at the same time. But you can't use a shield with a bow in your main hand, for example, because the bow will use the right click before the shield can. This is useful for far more than just shields though, such as putting a torch in your offhand so you don't need to switch away from your pick while you're mining, or even more niche things like creating a ladder pillar just by holding forward and right click. You can also quickly swap items into and out of your offhand by pressing F to switch your offhand with your current main hand, which I find I do quite often. Also, if you would like to switch which hand is your main hand, there's now a setting for that under the skin customization section. Next up we have the changes to enchantments. First, since we've been talking primarily about combat thus far, some of the combat related enchantments have been nerfed a little bit. Sharpness won't be quite as effective as it was, and there isn't near as massive a difference between the higher levels of protection now. They did also add in 2 new treasure enchantments, enchants that can only be gotten from loot chests, fishing, or villager trading. The first of which is Frostwalker, a boot enchantment that temporarily freezes the water around you as you walk over it, allowing you to quickly run across any body of water. Note that the ice it creates is a special version that cannot be gathered, and it will break automatically after a few seconds. The second enchantment is Mending, which will undoubtedly be one of, if not the most desired enchantment in the game. Mending can be put on any item, and what it does is take the XP that you pick up when the item is in your main hand, or if you're wearing it if it's armor, and use that XP to directly repair the item. This repair is cheaper than normal and does not affect the actual repair cost in any way, meaning that the enchantment gives us a way to permanently keep our favorite items rather than having them eventually become too expensive to repair. There has also been a change to Silk Touch in that it can no longer be put on shears, but don't worry, you can now gather cobwebs with just regular old unenchanted shears anyway. This does mean that you can no longer have an infinite Silk Touch for things like glass though, which is quite unfortunate. There's also been one small change to anvils, and that's that renaming your items no longer increases the repair costs. It will still cost a single level to do the renaming, but it won't be treated as a repair like it was before, so there's little reason not to name your favorite gear anymore. Before we dive into brewing, there's been a nice GUI change regarding the potions as well as beacon effects. Now, when you're under one of these effects, it will have an icon up in your top right corner, and as the effect begins to wear off, it will start blinking more and more to give you a visual indicator of roughly when it will wear off. This means you no longer need to open up your inventory constantly just to check what types of effects you have on you. Now we can talk about brewing, which has also had a few big changes. The most obvious of which is the new slot in the brewing stand interface, and this is where we put the fuel source that's now required for us to brew, which is blaze powder. This may seem like a little bit of a hassle, but in reality it's not that big of a deal because a single blaze powder is enough to go through 20 stages of brewing. To put that into perspective, some of the more complicated potions require 4 stages of brewing, and a single stack of blaze rods will give you enough blaze powder to brew nearly 3 dozen double chests full of those potions. So it's pretty trivial. We also can now make splash potions out of any type of potion. Interestingly, this also includes regular water bottles, resulting in splash water bottles which can be used to put out fires. We also have a brand new potion ingredient that can be added exclusively to splash potions, and it's called Dragon's Breath. We'll cover how you get it in a little bit, but the point of it is to create a new type of potion called a lingering potion. When you throw these, they explode into a cloud of particles wherever they land, and they give the same effect as the potion you threw. The cloud will linger for roughly 30 seconds if left untouched, but it will deplete much faster if any player or mob goes through it and takes on some of its effect. And of course, as mentioned earlier, they can be used for tipped arrows as well. So how do we get the Dragon's Breath? Well, from the dragon, of course. It's part of the new end dragon fight, and it's just the first of many changes that we're going to see in the end. The portal out of the end will now be generated in the middle of the island, with 10 obsidian pillars in a circle around it, and the end crystals on top of those, just like they were before, except a couple of them will now also have iron bar cages around them, preventing you from simply shooting them down from the ground. In addition to that, the dragon herself behaves quite a bit differently as well, being a good bit more aggressive, launching fireballs from the sky that explode and leave behind little pools of particles that you don't want to stand in, and periodically landing in the middle and spewing out even more of those particles herself. These purple particles can be collected in empty bottles, and that's what gives you the Dragon's Breath item that you need for the lingering potions. All of these changes can apply themselves to your old world, so you will not need to reset your end or anything like that to experience the new dragon fight. Thankfully, we also have more than one chance to get Dragon's Breath as well, because you can now respawn the dragon whenever you want to. In order to do this, you will need to create 4 Ender Crystals yourself, each one of which takes 7 glass, an Eye of Ender, and a gas tier, and then place each one on one of the 4 sides of the bedrock portal frame in the end. This will reconstruct the natural Ender Crystals and spawn the dragon once again, allowing you to repeat the fight and gather more Dragon's Breath. Any dragons after the first one will only drop a small amount of XP and no egg, so unfortunately they're not really farmable for either of those things. You can place those end crystals elsewhere, by the way. They only can be placed on a bedrock or obsidian, but you can always remove the obsidian after you place them. Once you've defeated the new dragon for the first time, you will briefly see a beacon in the distance. This is an indicator of where your new end gateway is spawned. Now, this is a small portal that you can't fit into normally, and you'll have to use an ender pearl to get into it, and what it does is teleport you far out into the end, where you'll find the new outer end islands. These new islands are quite a bit different from the main one though. There's an infinite number of them, starting about 1,000 blocks away from the central island, and they will all be covered in a new type of plant called a chorus plant. This is a crazy looking plant that grows upwards, frequently branching out as it does, and easily grows up to 15 or more blocks tall. Breaking part of one of these plants will break all of the blocks that are growing off of it in a pretty satisfying animation, and it will result in a rain of chorus fruits. These fruits can be eaten, and they have the effect of randomly teleporting you around, similar to how Endermen do, and it will always land you on a solid surface, so it can be a last-ditch way to avoid fall damage. The more practical use for these fruits, however, is to cook them in a furnace and turn them into popped chorus fruit. This cooked variant can then be crafted into the new purpur blocks, which is a nice purple brick-like block that has pillar, slab, and a stair variant to go along with it. You can also combine the popped chorus fruit and a blaze rod to get the new end rod, a small white rod that acts as a light source. These can be placed anywhere and also can connect together in pairs. These new chorus plants are farmable, however can be a bit tedious. They can only grow on end stone, but more importantly you can only grow them by using a chorus flower, which is a block that grows at the ends of the branches in a chorus plant. These flowers will only drop when they are broken manually though, so you can't simply break down the plant or harvest them automatically in any way. There are various ways to try and optimize collecting these, but it's unfortunately always going to be a manual task. In addition to the new purpur blocks, endstone itself was also given a new purpose in the form of endstone bricks, which can be crafted in a 2x2 grid similar to stone bricks, though they unfortunately can't be turned into stairs or slabs. If you roam around in the new end islands for a little bit, you'll eventually come across a structure made of these endstone bricks, as well as some purpur blocks and end rods mentioned earlier. This is a new structure called an end city. These will frequently contain chests with some really good loot, but in order to reach that, you'll first need to get past the new hostile mob called a shulker. These little guys behave sort of like turrets, occasionally popping open their purple shells to fire guided projectiles towards you. These projectiles will only move in straight lines along X, Y, and Z coordinates, and will actively try to seek you out. If you're hit by one, you'll take a little bit of damage, but also get the levitation effect. This effect makes you slowly float up into the sky for about 10 seconds, and when it wears off, you'll plummet straight back down to the ground. So do be careful about that. The shulkers themselves can be a little bit tricky to kill as they have a ton of armor when their shells are closed, so make sure to aim for the times when they poke their little faces out to get max damage. If you manage to get past the shulkers and navigate your way up and around in the towers of the end city, you may also find one other interesting part of the structure, and that's a small floating ship off to the side. The ship also has a few shulker guards, as well as a couple loot chests, but it more importantly contains 2 of the rarest items in the game. On the front of the ship you'll find a mounted dragon's head, which you can break and bring with you. This head can be placed anywhere, and can even take a redstone signal which will make its mouth move, or you could wear it like a mask. What awaits inside the ship is even cooler than the dragon's head though, and that is the Elytra. This is a special piece of armor that you can put on your chest slot, but it doesn't give you any protection. Instead, it behaves like a glider, allowing you to press jump again as you're falling to activate it, and you'll begin to glide through the sky for some pretty impressive distances. It can take a little practice to get used to it, but once you do, it is an absolute blast to get around the game with it. The Elytra does take durability damage as it's used, so if you can't put mending on it, you should at the very least keep an eye on it so you can repair it with some leather when it gets low. If you happen to have a cape, then the Elytra will actually inherit the cape's texture, and we've also been told that we'll eventually be able to texture these however we want to as part of our skins, which will probably lead to some pretty epic combinations. While we're on the subject of skins, all of the outer layers of your skin can now have semi-transparent pixels, meaning that we can now have things like sunglasses that you can actually see through or cool glowy effects. Between this and the future ability to skin the Elytra however we want to, there's probably going to be a lot of really epic skins flying around after 1.9. Moving back to the overworld, we do have a couple other changes to structures and terrain generation. The first being that we are no longer limited to only 3 strongholds. Instead, there will be up to 128 of them spread a bit further out throughout the world. Do keep in mind that, as with any other terrain generation, if the chunks have been loaded before 1.9, then they will not generate the structure after you update. We also have a new small structure that we can find out in the world, and that is an igloo. These will generate in ice plains and cold taiga biomes, and are simply a small snow hut with a few things inside like a bed and a furnace. In roughly half of these igloos, you may also find a secret trapdoor hidden underneath the carpet. Following this down will take you into a stone room where you'll find a priest villager and a zombie priest villager locked in cells, as well as all of the necessary tools to convert the priest zombie villager back into a living one. This is also a good opportunity to point out the new textures of zombie villagers. They now show their appropriate professions even as a zombie, and will retain that profession after you cure them. Next up is one of the most anticipated changes in years. Boats have finally been fixed. That's right, boats are no longer completely worthless and they've had a complete overhaul. The first thing you'll notice is the change to the model. The boats now have oars that roll as you move along, and they're also now textured based on the wood that you used to create them. Riding around in boats is now infinitely more enjoyable than it has been for quite some time. The controls are responsive and easy to get used to, being controlled with only your normal movement keys now, and they no longer break on collision, which is amazing. They no longer massively desync and drop you in the middle of nowhere, and the boats themselves are a good bit faster in general. You can no longer spin around inside the boat to look all around you, instead being limited only to looking 90 degrees in either direction, but that's not really that inconvenient once you get used to it. You can also no longer attack while you're actively moving the boat, since you obviously need both your hands for the rowing. The way you get out of the boat has also updated. It will dismount you in the direction you're looking, and it will put you up on land if you're looking at it and close enough, so no more jumping into the water and sending your boat sailing away. Additionally, you can now have up to 2 entities in a boat. This means that you can bring a friend along for the ride or transport animals across water. Unfortunately, the new boats are a little bit clunky when it comes to trying to automate them with something like an eats road or anything along those lines, but they do have some interesting properties with slime blocks that you may want to experiment with. Whilst on the subject of boats, water has also had one really nice change in this update. Water will no longer have that hideous flowing animation when it's next to glass, meaning that your underwater bases can now look pretty awesome. Now let's talk about a few changes to building, starting with an interesting new block called a grass path. You get this by right-clicking on a grass block with your shovel, and yes, it does need to be a grass block, it cannot be dirt. The block has a yellowish-brown texture on top and does indeed work really well for paths. They're also 1/16 of a block shorter than a full block, similar to farmland or soul sand, which means that hoppers can pull items through them. Next we have trapdoors, which have gotten a couple interesting changes. Trapdoors no longer need to be supported by another block. You'll frequently need to place them against something else, but once they're in place you can remove those temporary blocks and the trapdoors will remain there. This means that you can now use them for a lot of interesting little details and whatnot that you never could before because you always needed a solid block to be around them. They also now function as a ladder if the block below them is also a ladder. This means that you can now just place them at the top of your ladders as a hatch and climb right out without needing to jump, as we always have in the past. Next up we have both glass panes and iron fences. If you recall, when you placed either of these down with nothing to connect to, they would form a little cross shape. Well, they no longer do that, and they instead form these little 2 pixel by 2 pixel bars. Some people aren't the biggest fans of this, but I think it's a great look and it adds a really awesome small detail block that we just didn't have previously. Pistons have also had a relatively minor change, and that's that, unless they are sideways and extended, their surface will be treated like a solid block. They're still technically a transparent block, they'll still allow light through and whatnot, but the most important thing to note here is that this change means that mobs will be able to spawn on them. So if you're using pistons in a dark part of your floor design to prevent mobs from spawning, well, you're going to need to change it. Moving on, we have an interesting change to hay bales. They've implemented a much requested feature of having hay bales massively reduce your fall damage, a la Assassin's Creed. You now only take 20% of your usual damage if you land on a hay bale, meaning that, without any armor, you can fall about 100 blocks and still survive. With Feather Falling 4, you could drop up to about 169 blocks and be just fine. We also have a new crop in the game called beetroot, which you may recognize if you play Pocket Edition, and you can find these in villages along with the rest of the crops. They're not overly useful to farm yourself, unfortunately. They can be turned into beetroot soup, which takes 6 beetroot and gives you 3 full haunches of hunger back, or you can turn them into red dye, or you can just use them as pig food. Next up is a huge number of small changes, which is that many things in the game have been given new sounds. Now I'm not going to list them all here, as there are quite a number of them, but you will notice most of them pretty quickly. A lot of old sounds have been redone, including things like doors, fence gates, pressure plates, and chests. A lot of new sounds have been added for things like equipping armor, emptying and filling buckets, placing boats, or even interacting with item frames. Even a lot of mobs have newly added sounds, my favorites being the comical witch laughing and the weird noises that the shulkers make. There's also a new rain sound that's way less obnoxious than the old one, so you may even want to turn your weather sounds back up a little bit. I haven't even come close to mentioning half of the sounds that are added to the game, so be sure to keep your ears open for them. All this talk of new sounds was probably a little bit disheartening for players who don't have the best hearing, but don't worry, the game now has a subtitle system to help improve your gameplay experience as well. Under the music and sound settings window, there's now a button labeled Show Subtitles, and after that's enabled, they will show up in the bottom right corner of your screen. These also point you to the direction the sound came from, so if you want to be a tiny bit cheaty, you can also enable this to help find things like caves. In addition to some of them getting new sounds, there have also been some other changes with mobs as well. The first and most welcomed of which is that mobs will no longer spawn on top of rails, nor on top of most things that are redstone related. This means no more annoying pigmen on your nether rails, and substantially less mobs spawning in your redstone areas. Do keep in mind that it also means that mobs can no longer spawn on pressure plates. So if you're still using some older designs for things like Enderman farms that require them to spawn on top of a pressure plate, you're going to need to change it. Skeletons have also been made a bit more deadly through a series of updates. Most notably, they will now try to avoid close combat, actively strafing away from you as they shoot if you get too close, meaning that you need to sort of chase them down a bit if you want to kill them with melee. This new AI also means that they will frequently not just blindly charge in to attack you around corners like they used to, and will instead stand back for a bit or even poke around corners and then go back. Thankfully, they also have a bow drawback animation now, similar to how the player does, meaning that if you're attentive enough, you can pretty accurately guess when they're going to take a shot at you, and using the new shields, you can completely negate the damage from that. The new shields are incredibly useful for fighting these new skeletons, so if you're going to be doing a lot of fighting, they're very recommended. Skeletons have also been turned into a mini boss fight of sorts. During thunderstorms, there is now a chance for a trapped skeletal horse to spawn. If you get within 10 or so blocks of it, a bolt of lightning will hit the horse, and you will instead be faced with 4 skeletal horses, each with a skeleton rider that has an enchanted helmet and bow. The skeletons fight the same way as they do normally, including the new AI where they try to avoid melee, but they are much faster due to being on horseback. If you can manage to take out just the skeletons, then you can actually ride the skeletal horses yourself. They are tamed automatically, so all you need is a saddle, but they unfortunately cannot be equipped with armor and you cannot breed them. Passive mobs have also had a couple changes, most notably that rabbits are now smaller, a bit less common, and will only spawn in certain colors in specific biomes. You will only find yellowish rabbits in a desert and white ones in snow biomes, for example. Additionally, the snow golem also has gotten a goofy little update. If you weren't aware of this, the snow golem has always just been wearing the pumpkin over his actual head, and his normal, derpy face was always hidden underneath it. Well, now you can unmask him by right-clicking him with a pair of shears. This will pop the pumpkin off of his head, revealing the original texture hidden underneath it. A silly and completely pointless change, but I'm still glad it was added. There was also one significantly useful keybind change to the game, and that's that we can now use pick block in survival. If you're not familiar with it, in creative mode we've been able to middle click using our mouse wheel when we mouse over a block to automatically switch to that block in our hand. Now obviously in survival you can't just pull blocks from thin air in the same way, but instead you can now middle click over a block, and if we have that block anywhere in our inventory, it will bring it to our hand. So if you're working with a bunch of different block types and you can't keep them all on your bar at the same time, well, if you happen to have a block you need nearby, you can just look at it, middle click, and you'll have it. No need to fumble through your inventory. The rest of the things I'm going to be covering today are somewhat less significant changes, the first being that fire can actually last a little bit longer in the rain now. Mostly this means that thunderstorms actually pose a bit of a threat to burning things down again. It's still relatively unlikely for fire to spread fast enough to cause a problem, but do expect your flammable structures to take damage from time to time as a result. Next is that ender pearls have a cooldown, meaning they can no longer be spammed quickly. You can see how long the cooldown lasts by watching the little bar move across its icon in your hotbar after you throw one. Golden apples have also had a bit of a change, mostly that the enchanted golden apples, commonly known as notch apples, are no longer craftable. Instead, you can only find these in loot chests around the world, and the achievement you would get previously for crafting one has been changed to require that you eat one instead. As usual, they've also done a lot of performance enhancement stuff, including improving pathfinding AI, making redstone updates render faster visually, and making it so particles are no longer entities and have a far less substantial impact on performance than they did previously. They also did an enormous amount of bug fixing, which I'm obviously not going to recite entirely here, but there are a couple bug fixes that are going to affect the more technical players in the game. The first is that melting ice will now update the water source block and cause it to flow, meaning that we can no longer make the floating water source blocks that we could before, which is quite an unfortunate and very pointless change if I do say so myself. More important than that, however, is that they also fixed a collision bug in the game that was causing a lot of issues, but it was also what the test 137E29 elevators depended on. These were the elevators that used the collision glitches with fences to send items up through the ground, and were by far the most well-used designs for any vertical item transport. If you've built anything technical, there's a good chance that you've used one of these in your world, and you're going to need to modify it before 1.9 if you want it to continue to work. None of the alternatives are quite as nice as the original, but they are around if you do a quick search. One last thing that's not a gameplay change, but I feel it's worth mentioning. The world selection screen has gotten some updates as well. Your worlds now have an automatically generated icon when you load into them, and you can even change that icon if you really want to. More importantly though, there are now warnings when you load worlds into snapshots, or when you try and load a new world into an older version of the game. This is to prevent players from corrupting their worlds and forgetting to make backups. So, with that, I believe I've covered every big change in 1.9 that will affect your survival gameplay. As always, if I haven't explained something clearly enough, or if you just have questions about something in this video, then feel free to ask me down in the comment section below. So, that's all I got for you guys today. Hopefully it was helpful, and I'll see you guys next time.